but they also are not aware too that like your employees are often your biggest risk. And, you can walk into a wide net of traps that's been out there since like the early 2000s. I hear people that, well, I want a different screensaver, and then they blow up their network.
Welcome back to the Mission Secure podcast. This is part 2 with David Hamilton. David, thanks for continuing the conversation with me. We had so many great things to talk about last week, and I just couldn't stop the conversation. I have so much more I want to ask you, so I appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us again.
Of course. Yeah, happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Awesome. Okay, I want to talk about a common myth that I hear a lot, and that is, I have cybersecurity. You're supposed to stop all the attacks. Why do I need cyber liability insurance? Or sometimes I hear the opposite. Hey, I have insurance, so I'm not going to pay for cybersecurity. So what would I see insurance and security as two pieces of protection puzzles? I know you like puzzles. I see us working together. So in my mind, cybersecurity stops, 99% of the attacks. But let's face it, no security can stop all attacks, especially with the advent of AI and just how fast these attacks are coming and how convincingly they're coming. So I know that we're going to do the best to stop those attacks, and we will most of the time. But, insurance is your safety net, and it's your financial backstop. I'm the shield, you're the financial backstop. So what would you say to that myth? Do you ever hear that from people?
All the time. Yeah. It's it can really go into, and you've probably heard these terms, either a morale hazard or a moral hazard. And insurance terms, anybody getting licensed in the field will definitely know those.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it kind of comes into just a general lack of understanding, because people don't know what they don't know. And I mean, even if you're confident as a business owner and you've been through a few passes, like, with an IT company, they don't realize the rate of change and the evolution of how everything's working. The most common myth is like, okay, well, we're a small business. Okay, very subjective term. Why would anybody want this? It's kind of the assumption of like deferred responsibility. Like, they're not worried about it, but they also are not aware too that like your employees are often your biggest risk. And, you can walk into a wide net of traps that's been out there since like the early 2000s. Like, I still I hear people that, well, I want a different screensaver, and then they blow up their network. I'm like, there are just so many easy traps that,
Yes.
If you don't have security, or despite your best measures, like if you have an employee that's learned how to work around them, that can also be working against you. So it's really finding good security solutions because, yeah, like you said, there's some, which are more superior to others, and they do make a difference. And I think it was an earlier point or a question you had, carriers do look at that. Because let's put it this way, if you go buy a product off the shelf at Best Buy, not to knock them or any products, but they're not all, created equal. And with the rate of how business is conducted online versus how it used to be even just a couple of years ago, it makes a vast difference because it's the detection modules. How do they work? The heuristic analysis, like what database do they connect to, and do you have more than one tool that does different things? Because a lot of people use Huntress and so forth. Well, Huntress is great, but there are things that Huntress does not do. So it's being aware of that. And for the business owner, yeah, okay, you've got a security product. It is supposed to do a lot of the lifting, but what happens if despite all best efforts, like there's a 0-day attack that you fall victim to? It may not be necessarily a direct attack on you, but, if you're one of those people that never clicks the update button, well, that's the problem. IT companies are great at being able to remotely manage and do, all the patching and so forth. But still, it's like, the business owner has to understand they have responsibility, whether they, have that assumption that it's elsewhere. Yeah, or go ahead.
You said a couple things. You said one of the other, probably the most common myth I hear is that I'm too small to be on a criminal's radar. And I'm like, listen, you are not too small to be hacked. You're just not the one that makes the news. You're not sensationalized. We hear all the big ones, but you deal every single day with small to mid-sized businesses that get compromised. And it is so unfortunate that the majority of those never fully recover. I grew up working in my family's small business, and so that's a passion project of mine is educating small business owners and equipping them with the security they need. So I'm so glad that you hit on that. The other one that you hit on, you mentioned earlier about a vendor getting compromised, and it's the business owner who feels the effects of that. So I talk a lot about vendor risk. Your vendor's risk is your risk. Your
Mhm.
vendor's compromise is your liability. If you make a list of your top vendors, what would you do if one of them gets breached and goes down? Do you have a backup plan? How would you conduct your business if their business experienced a cyber attack? So I thought that was a very important point that you brought up. It's something that we talk to companies about all the time, having your incident response plan in place, not just for your own company, but in case one of your vendors is hacked, what is your backup? How do you continue conducting your business if they go down?
Yeah. Well, and that's a lot of great points. That's the incident response plan. The most common thing I see is, okay, you've got this, but you've never tested it. You've never done like a dry run. And usually what goes with that is don't store your incident response plan on your computers, folks. If the
Say that
computers are
again.
inaccessible or go down, how are you
Yes.
going to get to it? So,
Yep. I'll add to that. Also, don't file them in a filing cabinet down the hall where they're just collecting dust. You said you have to practice them. You have to rehearse them. It's called a tabletop exercise, and a lot of people don't know what that means, but it is simply you get all of your stakeholders in a room. If your company goes down, if your vendor goes down, what do? Who makes the call to your customers and your clients and notifies them? Who makes the call to insurance? Does your insurance policy have an incident response team or a forensics team or a set of rules that they want you to follow? Like you said, you don't want to be reaching out to someone and then that information be discoverable, whereas your insurance policy has steps in place already for you to follow that will protect you. So there's just so many things that you say that corroborate, or they're just so aligned with what I teach as well. And in my mind, insurance, everything you're saying right now, is the ultimate social proof that everything we see on the cyber side and everything we try to warn about and protect and defend from, it's exactly what you're saying.
yeah, I mean, and that's it too. Like, with the incident response plan, there's a couple other things too. Like, yeah, don't have a file cabinet that, it's not being used. Also make sure whoever has access to it isn't the only one. Like if it's locked away, like what if that person's on vacation? Because, Murphy's Law is the thing.
Yes, it is.
So, the other thing about that too is like the stress testing of it is what most people, and it's not just cyber, they just don't do with their overall coverage in general. They don't think of the scenarios that could, potentially get them. And I mean, that's part of what I do is it's the risk management aspect, the risk advising is to kind of run through this. But with cyber in general, and I think I've got an analogy that should make this fairly quick.
Awesome.
What I tell people when it comes to like vendor exposure, yeah, if they go down, it's what I try to tell people. It's like cyber is not so much a technology coverage, it is a business continuity coverage. Because if your vendor goes down, yes, you have to find out, can you still operate? What does this do to your profits? What's your issue there? But also, what is your potential exposure for a downstream data breach? Because if your client data is also, enveloped in their information, their systems, whatever, you technically are responsible to your clients downstream for a data breach, even if you had no, hand in it. So it's like I tell people, think of like three circles. This is you, this is your upstream, this is your downstream. How do these all connect? Because, the downstream people are going to want you to make them whole again because you're their first call, even if somebody upstream has this problem. And it's kind of like your upstream access isn't just like a specific vendor. You need to think about that in terms of your technology layers. Like most offices, I mean, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Adobe, any of these, whatever your individual like CRMs and so forth, those are all exposure points. Any one of those could cause a data breach to trigger just because of common data that is shared. And so your vulnerability is like everybody has a data collection vulnerability. It doesn't matter if you're putting it on a third party cloud. This is the assumption of responsibility that most people have is the burden of liability does rest with them, but still you can be responsible for it, you know? So if you don't have a cyber policy, if you're not forward thinking, stress testing your exposures in a modern day business environment, that is where you can have a ton of costs come out of pocket. And I've actually worked with and seen a business go under because they were woefully unprepared. And despite all best efforts, they did not listen to advice from, a cyber resilience expert, their IT vendor, or, anybody on the insurance side. So it's, it's a sad story, but like you said, it doesn't matter how small you are. You might just be too small to make the news, but it's still potentially going to happen.
Yeah. I talk a lot about proving that you're protected, because you can be prepared. You can assume you're prepared. You can assume your IT guy is handling your cybersecurity. You can assume that your vendor has your data protected. But unless you actually practice that preparation and can prove that it works, if you've practiced your backups under pressure, if you've practiced your incident response plan, everyone knows what to do. You know that plan works. That's how you truly protect your profits. And I think that's one of the reasons why vendor vetting is so important. A vendor can tell you, they have your data secured. And, at the time that you signed the contract, maybe that was last year. So we encourage everybody to use a set of vendor vetting questions where you're asking them, what is your security posture? What measures do you have in place? If your system is compromised, how does that affect my business? How soon do you notify me? You've got to vet your vendors and really understand what their posture is as well, because they're upstream. And here's what criminals know. Criminals know that to gain access to hundreds of businesses, they only need to attack one vendor. They need to breach one vendor. So some, criminals are lazy and they'll take the easy low-hanging fruit, but others are more methodical and they do go after those vendors because they know that once that system is breached, they have access to all those other companies' data and their information. And so just proving that you're not just assuming that your vendor has your data, but prove it by asking them some vendor vetting questions. And you know what? If they lie or if they answer them incorrectly, you can still show that you did your due diligence. You had the security conversation with them. And that is so important when it comes to insurance and proving that you've done, what you're supposed to do to protect your business from a breach.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And a lot of people don't, it's like the joke about the end user license agreement. Nobody really ever reads those. Scroll to the bottom, click accept, and you don't really know what you're signing away.
Who reads the fine print?
Exactly. Well, in a lot of cases, it's like it's becoming important now because part of the vulnerabilities come from that, for an app or a developer, anybody that's like, we need access to all these different parts of your system, more common on mobile and so forth. But still, I mean, if you're just blindly accepting this without looking at it, like you could be creating a new vulnerability you're not aware that exists. And a lot of cases, those contracts, especially in insurance, I look at risk transfer items all the time. So like, what is this vendor upstream requiring? They want to be protected because they see themselves higher up on the food chain than you. So you might be giving things like additional insured status. You might be waiving your rights of subrogation to where that even if they have something happen, you may have no recourse. And if you missed it, that could be the difference, because even if your coverage is, bulletproof, like if you have done something that creates your own, hole that you've poked in it, I mean, that is a problem that is very real, especially with the fact that think like every time you update, Google Chrome or something or receive some new update, there's always fine print. But if you've already accepted it, you may not be realizing what the new changes are too. So, but yeah, doing due diligence will help you in so many ways, regardless of, whatever the situation may be.
Right. And those vendors operate under what's called like a shared responsibility model. So they're coming into your system, they're accessing your data, but it's your responsibility to, operate under the principle of least privilege, where you're giving them the room and the space that they need to do their job, but no more. How much of my data are you accessing? What are you doing with it? And then after you offboard a vendor, let's face it, we bring on new vendors, we get rid of vendors. Are you shutting those vendors down properly? Are you cutting off access to your data in your systems? That's really important as well.
Yeah. And that's another thing why, I usually make sure when I'm having a conversation, with IT folks, with, businesses, it's like, hey, that's a very important thing, not just vendor offboarding and onboarding, but, employees as well, because I can't tell you the number of times that I've had to fix an issue because some employee was left in the Active Directory years ago or, they had a password that just aged out, but there were no controls of forced updating. So somebody was able to get in and do a whole lot of damage. So it's really important. And, everybody in the company kind of needs to be aware of this. I mean, your entry level employees, sure, they're not going to have much of a responsibility, but it's kind of all the same thought process. Like everybody's got to buy into, the control aspect of things. So, and of course it starts at the top down, but yeah, the zero trust or limited trust, like that is so crucial. And so many people don't think of that. So it's one of those things that I pointedly, because I've, had to triage this so many times, is you need to have a policy that triggers every time you go through one of these situations. It needs to be ingrained in everybody's mind. This needs to happen, because otherwise, yeah, it's a nasty surprise, just, like a landmine sitting somewhere.
Yep. That's one of the things that we help companies do, is put those security policies and procedures in place. You mentioned something about it needing to come from the top down, and I constantly preach that cybersecurity, cyber posture, cyber hygiene is a leadership issue. I think people, in my experience, they put it off on IT. It's an IT issue, but IT and cybersecurity are two very separate and distinct specialties. And when you do have a cyber attack, when your bad day does come, those decisions, the decisions to get insurance involved, the decisions to engage forensics, the decision to notify customers or employees, those aren't just IT decisions. I mean, your IT may be involved, but cybersecurity, that's a leadership issue, and it does have to come from the top down.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's kind of like corporate culture, just, individual organization culture. Like the leadership has to know this because they're the ones that have to put it out. And I mean, everybody sees, if leadership is not, walking the walk. So, I mean, it gets infectious, and it's one of those things too that, you have to like have these conversations periodically, or in a lot of ways, like the, phishing training campaigns, a lot of other things, those are invaluable because it just keeps it in the forefront of people's mind to where it's like it's impossible to forget. And a lot of those courses now, Huntress, CrowdStrike, even some of the insurance carriers out there are now offering security training as part of a, add-on to their premium, because they're looking at the proactive aspect on this. The more they can control things, the less likely they are to have to pay out claims, which, people may see this as an added cost or anything to their program, but, it can lower insurance premiums overall because, again, they're taking the steps to help themselves. So, yeah, it's incredible.
Okay. You said something. I want to ask you about it. Insurance companies providing security and cybersecurity. I know that, you said that helps ensure that the risk is properly covered. They're getting good employee awareness training. Is there any type of conflict of interest in that to you, having insurance offer security?
So it's kind of, I've looked at it too. And I know a lot of MSPs I work with are not a fan of that because they feel like it's pushing them out and like insurance is trying to do too much.
Yeah. I see that side.
Yeah, for sure. And I do too. I think it's kind of a beneficial thing in a lot of cases because there are plenty of IT companies out there that they don't offer those services. So it's really an added benefit to them because, you can put more things in place, more services. You can structure things a little bit better because you have a customer that's willing to work with you. And I feel like it breaks down the resistance barrier. But at the same time, yeah, it is a little interesting the extent that some of them are going. And a lot of times it's partnering with programs that are already out there that are sometimes directly available to the consumer anyway. It's kind of like there are insurance carriers out there that will bypass the agent because they can work with the customer directly too. So I'm not a fan of those for the same concept.
Right.
So I think it really depends the guardrails, what they're willing to do, because at the end of the day, the more services a company offers, technically, the more exposures they are creating for themselves. So I haven't seen one of these situations, but I have to ask, like, what does a situation look like where if a cyber carrier does offer a tool that borders in IT, that tool fails, which is supposed to be the backbone of what they use to pay a claim, how do they decide that? I mean, because if it's really their fault, you're doing everything you're supposed to and can prove that. I don't see insurance companies, eagerly going like, oh yeah, that's our bad. Yeah, we got you covered. So
it's an interesting conversation, though. It's like where it's such an interesting intersection, and I love how our industries complement one another. But when I see insurance companies offering security services, I'm like, oh, that's a little sticky. It's interesting to me to discuss. One thing I do want to ask you about, because we're all using AI. I love AI. We use tools that use AI. We use it in our job. I use it in my job every day. AI is introducing risk, though. We focus heavily on AI readiness and secure use of AI before AI implementation. I find that companies, first of all, a lot of companies have no idea how their employees are using AI. When you ask them that, they really don't know. So as they begin to adopt, Copilot and Claude and all the different AI models into their company, maybe they are purchasing the enterprise versions, the corporate versions. They're paying for them. But there's still, AI introduces such risk. And so I'm curious, a business owner's policy is an all perils policy, as we established earlier. It typically covers anything that's not excluded. So I think my first question is, are you seeing any AI exclusions as AI begins to introduce risk? And secondly, do you see AI liability policies in the future? Like, cyber liability isn't meant to cover AI liability either. So can you pull out your magic 8 ball and
sure.
give us some predictions or gut? You said you were a gut instinct person earlier. What do you see happening?
Yeah, it's a great topic. So I am starting to see AI exclusions.
Oh, interesting.
The bot policies I feel like are going to be some of the slower to evolve.
Okay.
Just because they, multi-part coverage of property liability, so forth. So if I'm looking at separate coverages that are packaged out to where each individual line is there, I was working with, which will be a good topic to get into possibly later, a plumbing and HVAC company. Their policies have AI exclusions on every line of coverage, including the auto, all the way down to the umbrella, because it has to remain consistent. So where that creates the trick is I'm also seeing certain cyber carriers including AI language now, specifically verbiage that's in there of what they will or won't do, because a lot of people may not realize, if it's not excluded on a policy, but it's not implicitly listed, that's
right.
We consider that the carrier is being silent on it. So, the burden is on them to prove why they wouldn't stand behind coverage if a claim occurs, but you don't want to leave it to the people that are, have big legal teams and so forth to, not to say they're going to do anything wrong. They have a responsibility to you for that coverage to stand up, but at the same time, it's such a new and emerging thing so quickly that, like you said, the exposures are everywhere. And most people, the biggest blind spot is they don't know where they have them, how employees are using it, if employees are. I've seen a lot of people that do not even understand what AI is in terms of what it looks like, how it can be used. Obviously, big danger. But the thing too is the preventative aspect, putting the guardrails on, establishing controls, boundaries, and limiting employee use is great, but it depends on how much of that can you realistically control. For example,
because if you don't give them the secure versions, I guarantee you they're going to find a workaround. They're going to be using their phone, or they're going to be using their personal device at work and putting your corporate data into it, because the same thing that makes us a good employee, our desire to do more, our desire to be more efficient, our desire to do good work, that's the same thing that's going to cause us to find a workaround if we're not being given the tools at our jobs that we need to do that. So it's kind of like this catch-22.
1,000% agree. And I witnessed this with, the early versions of ChatGPT, where it was, before it had access to the internet. So the data set was limited to September of 2021. Well, people didn't know that. They're asking modern questions. I'm like, if laws or, rules, anything has changed between then and now, have you vetted your control source? Most people don't think to ask those questions because they're just using it in a more basic way, like the question and response.
You don't
But
know what you don't know.
exactly. But then you get these companies, like a lot of folks are using it like in their onboarding processes, their CRMs. So you've got an upstream vendor exposure. Well, if you have no AI policy, how is that AI data going to be used? Like, you've got to find that out. And, even with the corporate versions of like Copilot, for example, like the first thing I did when I started using this is tell me where my boundaries are. I don't want any sensitive client data in your learning set. This needs to remain confidential, not public. And, there are specific ways you have to use Copilot for that to be true. If you just randomly pull it up and start dropping in sensitive client information, you have, run the risk it's out there, to some extent. So it's just the coaching. And the big thing for me is one of the bigger blind spots too, is there are so many laws in almost every state that are coming on board that have AI disclosure requirements. So, even if it's a chatbot, how does AI interact with your customers? How can it affect their data? It's kind of like the whole PCI DSS 4.0. Like nobody knows what it is, and everybody's got an exposure for that in the payment card industry. So it's like nobody's talking about these things, and I think it's part of the unique background that I have. It's like these are just in the back of mind at all times because I know there's so many layers to what the responsibility looks like. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. I don't know if AI is going to necessarily end up with its own policy setup. Because the interesting thing is right now, even if it's not included on a cyber policy, I'm looking at things like it may not truly be a cyber exposure. It might be partially a cyber exposure, but it could be an errors and omissions exposure of how it's used. It could just, literally be negligence. And if you don't know what your employees are using, how your company's using it, then that's on you. So it's kind of like if you take all the coverages of like BOP, general liability, professional cyber, there's all this interconnectedness now specifically with AI, and you have to follow the exclusions, and it gets messy. I haven't heard of too many super convoluted claims yet, but I'm very curious to see what the next few years are going to be like.
Yeah, I am too. Like, what would your recommendation, like maybe a tip or two to give a business owner on as they begin to implement AI, they have a desire to implement it securely. What is something that should they reach out to their, MSP? Should they be reaching out to you? Should we all be sitting at the same table having this conversation? What are some things business owners, need to be doing right now as they're beginning to implement AI?
That's a good point.
Do you tell your insurance company? Do you need to let your insurance company know we're using AI in this way? That way, if there is any sort of claim, the insurance company is aware.
I don't know if necessarily that's required at this point. If it's a cyber, that's probably a question to have with like your cyber carrier, or get the agent involved, get the IT company, get everybody in a room.
I agree.
Regardless of if it's a conversation with the insurance companies or not, just because like if a business owner is unclear, have the folks that are more, aware of what, different versions of AI, different incarnations, how people are going to access it, bring that to attention. And then the company needs to then verify, like, out of all this, like, we need to know what our employees are doing. And it needs to be an open thing, like nobody's, in trouble, but, that's how you kind of figure out the shell of how you want to craft the armor. Because, I can tell you, I've seen so many people, they're like, I heard somebody literally say, I don't know what an AI looks like. I'm like, oh, buddy, you need to talk to people who can inform you. And, that's the other thing too. It's like, it's all to set people up for success at the end of the day. And I think that's the message a lot of people sometimes lose in the process, because you're right. We're all in business to make money, but it's kind of like the saying, a rising tide raises all ships. It's like, that's really what we're going for at the end of the day. So yeah, I encourage everybody, to have those conversations. And it's your resilience people that are going to be looking at your incident response plan. If that's your IT folks, definitely that. Your insurance agent too, just to make sure they're aware, because maybe they've put coverage in 5 years ago and it hasn't been reviewed. That's you need.
Right. The coverage you had yesterday is not enough to protect you from the risks today. And we do encourage everyone to create that see something, say something environment in cybersecurity, where if you see something suspicious, even if you initially engaged on it, even if you clicked on it, the sooner you tell us, the sooner we can isolate it and contain it and stop it from, doing anything worse. I think it's the same thing with AI, having those conversations, hey, how are you using AI? And how are you using AI? Okay, we need to all get together and make sure that we're thinking about using this securely, not uploading our proprietary data, not using it to train a public model. I think it's just an open conversation. And you mentioned the word culture. I think it's part of the culture that we have to create at our companies today and with our clients today. Gosh, David, I could talk with you forever. We didn't even get to talk about transportation or logistics or the trucking industry, but I guess just signing off, what is one thing you wish every business owner understood about cyber liability insurance before they needed to use it? Is there anything yeah.
So, and I'll try to make this quick, and I think I can actually touch on the transportation aspect a little bit in that process.
Okay, awesome.
Everybody needs to have a conversation about cyber coverage, because even if you don't think you need it, there are industries where I see this the most, and that can be like agriculture, farmers, it can be plumbing and HVAC companies, it can be transportation companies, because as a quick example, it's again, what people don't know that they don't know. They don't think about these things. So if you take a plumbing and HVAC company, for example, they installed, and this is I don't know if it's made it outside the insurance industry, but it's a known issue where if you install like these smart home systems, well, they have to get updates from somewhere. So they're an Internet of Things device. There's a hole you've poked in your network to let, another company download an update. Mm-hmm. Well, what if that update bricks, kind of like Microsoft, bad update bricks, the airports and so forth. Okay, well, what if that bricks these systems and therefore heat doesn't turn on? What if you have a whole bunch of buildings where pipes burst? This has been a thing. So that's the upstream technology exposure that can go downstream, affect you directly, then affect your clients, obviously. So that's really the big threat, because it's part of the business interruption. Again, if one of those vendors goes offline, say for trucking companies, all the telematics that, track all these vehicles on, wherever they are in the country. If this goes down, and if you can't find your trucks, okay, what do? Well, that creates a problem, because even if it's not an attack, it could be an incident. Even if it's not really something that's major, what if you have no good control over your systems for, say, the better part of a week? How much revenue have you lost? Cyber will cover that, because that is a cyber exposure, whereas other policies are probably not going to, because those are more traditional perils. So I encourage everybody, just have the conversations, even if you think you don't need it. In a lot of cases, cyber policies are really not super expensive. And there's things that you can do to set yourself up for success in the future to not only avoid claims or denied claims, but also reduce your premiums and improve your business. I mean, the goal is people think about it in terms of if the business shuts down, they think from a revenue perspective. I implore people, think of it from, how does this affect your employees? You may have to pay payroll. If you are paying this out of pocket, how long can you do this? Can you do this? It's more to it. And, the big danger too, everybody's smartphone walks in and out of secure environments back to home environments, and who knows what that looks like. It's created big breaches for agency or, companies like Coinbase. It's a simple way to bypass, controls in place. And if you don't have guardrails, you may not have recourse. So at the end of the day, so many people just don't think things are going to happen, or, they don't know. So have a conversation with your insurance agent. If you feel like you need help with your IT company, talk to them, talk to everybody at the same time, have the conversations and do it now, because if you try to have these after an incident happens, you're doing life on hard mode.
That's all such a good point. So many great things that we talked about today. David, if someone would like to get in touch with you to learn more, what is the best way?
I usually tell people you can find me very easily on LinkedIn. It has all my contact information. I'm always happy to have a conversation. I am not a hard salesman. I'm not going to try to sell you a product. We're going to talk. That's at the very end of what we may even get to. So just want to help people.
One of my favorite things about your LinkedIn content is just how much education you do. I can I can validate that for people. You do a lot just to educate and to help people understand what their true risk is so that they can decide how they want to address it. David, thank you so much for joining me on this episode, the second episode of the Mission Secure podcast. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Bye, everyone.